Good evening, and welcome to the Lund Critical Debate of 2020. Our topic for tonight is global perspectives on the police and the public, and it's certainly an important time to take up such questions, a time when the international context itself sheds light on our understandings of domestic events, and that the domestic questions of relevance can illuminate international patterns and trends of great consequence. As the director of the Einaudi Center for International Studies, I'm very pleased to welcome everyone here tonight in partnership with the Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies. And I'm especially glad to welcome Judith Lund Biggs, who is joining us virtually. Judy established the Lund Critical Debate Series in 2008, and through her generosity, we're able to gather today for this virtual conversation, which I think really serves as a model of critical conversation and respectful discussion to take up topics of great significance. The Einaudi Center's research theme on global racial justice supports student and faculty research, public scholarship, and advocacy to inform national and international debates. And today we're pleased to be building on this central theme to discuss the tensions and the complexities around ensuring personal freedom and human rights in a world that is structured by inequalities, by racial and ethnic and religious marginalizations, of unequal justice, and of the use of coercive use of state force and international agents. Our goal in this theme of global racial justice is really to focus on policing tonight, and in all the work that we do, is really to expand our understanding amongst diverse publics, amongst our communities, locally and globally on these complex issues. And in doing so, and by adding the international perspective, we're able to dive into local and specific histories and legacies that allow us to deepen our understandings more generally. Our esteemed speakers tonight are really a perfect representation of that goal. So let us turn to them now with thanks to our expert speakers and all of our attendees for joining us for this critical conversation. And with a special thanks to the Einaudi staff team, particularly Scott Beamer, who has done incredible work to make this event possible. With that, I want to hand it over to my colleague, Rebecca Slayton, the Program Director for Peace and Conflict Studies and Associate Professor in the Department of Science and Technology Studies, who's co-hosting this event and who will introduce our speakers. Thank you, Rebecca.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Good evening, everyone. So as Rachel mentioned, I'm a professor in the Science and Technology Studies Department and the director of the Judith Reppy Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies at Cornell. I'm very glad that the Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies was able to partner with the Einaudi Center in organizing this evening's event. All around the world, police are charged with protecting and serving the public, but too often they protect wealthy and powerful publics at the expense of marginalized and politically repressed publics. In the United States, for example, studies show that Black men are 2.5 times more likely than white men to be killed by police over their lifetime. And Black people are twice as likely as white people to be unarmed when they are killed by police. These statistics suggest that the most publicized and horrific cases of brutality, the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile, and Michael Brown, to name only a few, are not anomalies. They're part of a systemic racist problem in policing. The history of racist policing in the United States is long, it's well documented. In other parts of the world, the history of policing is different. But the basic problem, the police often brutalize those most in need of protection, is the same. Police in Hong Kong were once widely respected and trusted, but in recent years, they have brutally repressed the pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong, engaging in arbitrary arrests, excessive use of force, and torture of detained individuals. The United Nations sends police on peacekeeping missions around the world with the goal of protecting basic human rights. And while peacekeepers often do reduce violence, sometimes they themselves abuse human rights, including instigating sexual violence. So these globally pervasive problems raise very urgent questions. Why do police turn on those that they should protect and serve? What roles can training play in preventing violence against vulnerable people? How can police be held accountable to all of the publics that they should serve, not just the wealthy and powerful? So tonight's discussion will address these and other important questions. It is my great honor to welcome and to introduce our two distinguished panelists, Luís Carrillo and Davenport, for tonight's discussion. Luís Carrillo is the United Nations Police Advisor. He has served since November 2017 as Police Commissioner and Director of the United Nations Police Division. He previously served as the Police Commissioner in multidimensional United Nations peacekeeping operations in Timor Leste, Haiti, and the Central African Republic. We also have with us tonight Christian Davenport, who is professor in the Department of Political Science and Public Policy at the University of Michigan. Professor Davenport's research focuses on racism, social movements, and political conflict, including human rights violations, genocide, torture, political surveillance, and civil war. His most recent book is The Peace Continuum, What It Is and How to Study It, published by Oxford in 2018. And finally, I'm very pleased to introduce our moderator for tonight's discussion, Sabrina Karim, who is the Hardest Family Assistant Professor for Teaching Excellence in the Department of Government and core member of the Repi Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies. Professor Karim's research focuses on peace and conflict processes, particularly the effect of UN peacekeeping reforms and police reform in post-conflict countries. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Karim to moderate tonight's discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to the Einaudi Center and for the Repi Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies for the opportunity to be able to moderate this discussion. And thank you to everybody with us tonight for joining us for this important discussion and dialogue around policing. We are lucky tonight to have two experts that can speak to us today about the global perspective on policing, which considers not just the US, but also policing around the world. Policing in the US came into the spotlight quite a bit this past year, as we all know, with some of the largest protests the country has ever seen against the murders of a number of people that Rebecca mentioned, including George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. But the US was not the only place where we saw this kind of activism around policing. We also have seen protests in Nigeria, where Nigerians took to the streets to protest the Special Anti-Robbery Squad. And so what we want to do today is to contextualize this activism and around police violence around the world by having a conversation with these two experts. So I'll just begin actually by a note about the format. We will be giving each speaker 3 to 5 minutes to provide opening remarks about policing in the global context. I'll have Christian go first and then Luís after that. And then we'll move to a set of prepared questions and spend about 10 minutes on each of those prepared questions, kind of with having a back and forth conversation about the topics that I raise. After about an hour of that discussion, we will move to taking questions from the audience. So now is a good time if something comes up to please enter the questions into the Q&A, and we will sort through those as well as sort through the entered questions during registration. So that's the format. And then, sorry, I should also mention that we'll wrap up with each person each speaker having a minute to any closing remarks that they'd like to share, reflections about the discussion, etc. So with that, I will let Christian go first, and then we'll have Luís give your opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me, and also thank you very much for focusing on this topic, as it's incredibly important. In many ways, I know that my position will seem somewhat interesting in many respects. I think as an African American and a male, I believe, and also when I grew up in New York, there might be many perceptions about exactly what it is that I might have to say, but I can clearly identify that much of the sentiment regarding the post-Floyd scenario I share, but the global perspective, I think, will also distinguish some of those remarks. So I like to spend the opening part kind of like reframing or reinterpreting exactly what I think we're doing, just to give my particular perspective. So for example, I wish to prioritize the public over the police as opposed to discussing policing in the public. Today, I will probably replace law enforcement agencies and police with Nicole Siegel's label of violence workers to more accurately reflect the situation under evaluation. Law enforcement agencies and police makes it seem as if the baseline in and of itself should be deference to law without necessarily acknowledging that laws are created to sustain very frequently specific human interactions, which are most often inequitable and exploitative. And in contrast, violence workers reminds us that those in states employ and are authorized to engage in violent activity against those within the relevant territorial jurisdiction. And that the principal distinguishing characteristic of these state actors from others is that they can call upon and employ coercion, force. And that distinction is something that's extremely important for those of us that do political science and are intricately connected with understanding what the state does. But as the state is reliant upon or can use coercion and force, these violence workers are incredibly important. And it's useful to think about exactly what we're talking about and who we're talking about, as opposed to those that engage in normative or material forms of power. And in all likelihood, I'll probably talk more about thriving than security, as the latter is not kind of prompts us in many respects to discuss violent activities and the worst of humankind, I'll suggest. Whereas thriving prompts us to talk a more holistic view to understand what is required to help humans be the best that we can be, which is not always something that comes up when we talk about the police. Now, thriving, I define it as the joint experience of development and success. And that emerges more or less from well-being and performance. And I'm sure I'll talk a little bit more about that. And I think I'm at time, so I'll stop.
Thank you. Luís, your opening remarks.
No, thank you very much, Sabrina and Chris, and ladies and gentlemen. I have a written speech, so I don't miss nothing of what I want to say. Good evening, and of course, first of all, let me thank Cornell University and the Unadi Center for their kind invitation. I am very honored to be here today representing, of course, the United Nations Police. And as we know, or for the ones that don't know, the United Nations Police occupy a unique role amongst the world's police, with about 11,000 women and men from over 90 countries around the world to serve in the front lines of 14 operations. And these operations are also around the world. I would say that our biggest richness is our diversity. United Nations presences in any country are mandated by the UN Security Council, particularly in peace operations. Most UN peace operations are integrated presences where the UN police work together with other entities of the United Nations, including justice, corrections, human rights, military, political offices, and UN agencies, funds, and programs like UN Women, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and other entities like the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, and humanitarian actors. The United Nations Police are often deployed in post-conflict situations where rule of law has been undermined. National police and other law enforcement institutions have either lost their credibility and or are themselves responsible for the violence against their people. The United Nations deploy to national authorities to maintain law and order, protect civilians, and engage with local populations. In rare instances, we have been authorized to substitute for host state police capacity, as it was the case in Kosovo and Timor Leste, where the United Nations had full executive responsibility for enforcing the law and addressing threats to public order. We provide direct operational support to host state police and other law enforcement agencies, as well as help build and develop their capacities to assume this responsibility themselves. From large multidimensional peacekeeping operations in Central African Republic, Darfur, Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, South Sudan, to smaller political missions like Colombia, Haiti, Somalia, and Yemen. We are often amongst the most visible representatives of the United Nations in the countries where we deploy, and for that reason alone, it is imperative that United Nations Police always act in a manner that is consistent with the UN Charter and the organization core values. Every United Nations police officer is a human rights officer. This year, the United Nations celebrates 60 years of United Nations policing. We were first deployed in Congo, and since that day, the form of the United Nations police takes and has continued to evolve in line with the conflict dynamics on the ground, but our core function has remained the same. Building on the Organization Action for Peacekeeping Initiative and the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, the UN Police, as we have done over the past 60 years, we will continue to adapt, including taking on a greater role across the entire peace and security spectrum, from preventing conflict to building and sustaining peace. It goes without saying that the objectives of lasting peace and sustainable development can only be achieved on the equality, human rights, and dignity of everyone. Racism and racial inequality challenge every government, every society, and every organization, including our own. As our Secretary General has noted, all too often, race determines a person's opportunities for education and employment, their access to healthcare and justice. Access across the world, many people continue to be trapped in generational cycles of poverty and structural racism, and as a result, they are also amongst the communities hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. And I will end now. Equal rights are enshrined in the founding charter of the United Nations. Just as the United Nations fought apartheid years ago, we must continue to fight the hatred, oppression, and humiliation today. The United Nations police are certainly no exception. The communities we serve are counting with us to lead by example and to exhibit the highest degree of professionalism, ethical behavior, and respect for diversity. So I'm looking forward for the next discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you both for those opening remarks. So this first question I'm going to pose first to Christian. And Christian, feel free to reinterpret the question within your framework if you like. And then Luís, I will ask you to kind of respond to Christian's comments. But the first question for me is about this potential trade-off between human rights and ensuring order and security. So it seems like that whether or not law enforcement agencies, irrespective of the country, could face this kind of a trade-off between respect for human rights and ensuring order and security. So my question is, what are the synergies between ensuring human rights, personal freedoms, as well as making sure that the individuals in the country are secure and providing security kind of in what, Christian, you might think is more of a traditional sense? And what are the contextual factors or other elements that make the overlap stark or make the trade-off more challenging? So I'll let you reflect about that.
Interesting. So in my opinion, there's less a trade-off than a range of coercive or forceful actions that are applied to protect the status quo. And so from that perspective, we need to differentiate between levels of this coercive and forceful behavior, rates of this coercive and forceful behavior, and the kind of perceived necessities of engaging in the relevant behavior. So I think you're less likely to see coercion and force in a civil society after civil society has been purged of dangerous ideas, individuals, and institutions. That's not a free society. It's now been purged in many respects, right? But it might look stable, less violent, and more secure. So from that particular perspective, it's difficult to kind of evaluate the kind of human rights, freedom, security dynamic, because we're going to have this interesting dynamic of violent behavior, and we need to kind of track this over this conflict cycle in many respects in order to kind of gauge its vicissitudes and also its consequences. The application of the trade-off language, I think, is somewhat problematic because in many respects, normative and material power haven't been developed in certain places where we talk about applying coercive and forceful power. And so then it becomes an interesting kind of dynamic. But I think as long as we have inequality, we're going to have violence workers being active largely under the cover of law and order. And this is what becomes somewhat difficult, I think. And I think a recurring theme for me is I want public conceptions of rights, freedoms, and security and other objectives to be front and center. We don't really ask people quite frequently about what trade-off they would like to see, but in order to make police and violence workers beholden to the public that I think that they serve, I think that this needs to be a little bit more explicit. So I don't see freedom and security as being as important as sustainability and thriving. And so security might be needed for development, but who says development should be the goal that we're prioritizing in much of our kind of discussions of what's going on when things are inequitably distributed, right? We spend so much time talking about development, we don't talk about distribution, but the reason why we have crime in the first place is because of this distribution, and then the police, violence workers are brought in subsequently in order to protect that.
Okay. Luís, are there parts that you would like to respond to?
Yeah, well, the police is one of the, as we know, one of the most visible faces of the state, and particularly in the theaters where the United Nations police engage, usually either in particular on that the conflict is present by political reasons, ethical, religious, geographic resources, personal gains, power. So the conflict is present, and it's always very difficult the balance between freedom and security. And this should go hand in hand. Of course, we are not going for deeper discussions in terms of the protection of the civic space, but particularly where the United Nations police is present, clearly the set of the human rights framework, because sometimes it's the only kind of law that is present, should be clearly respected. That's where I say that every police officer, every United Nations police officer is a human rights officer. And clearly, the United Nations, the big richness, we have police officers from more than 90 countries all over the world. And the principles of democratic policing should apply. Because once again, in some of these areas, it is exactly the principles of the chart, the human rights principles that apply and that make possible the life in society. And then, of course, to go further to the development, to further social, economic, and of course, to be possible for the people to live freely in society. I can come back later to the democratic principles of policing and what it represents, particularly now in the world of COVID, because we know that this balance between freedom and security, it's a reality where the police officers, of course, play a key role.
Great. Christian, would you like to respond? Or I have a point that I'd like to bring up just hearing you both talk. Unless you want to respond first.
Luís is interesting because one, he's incredibly charming, so it's hard to kind of like to pick at some of the points. But what I find interesting is his characterization, right? So each UN officer is a human rights officer, and the minute he says that, I'm just like, okay, I clearly want them patrolling Cleveland. I clearly want them in San Francisco. And so I think that degree of acknowledgement and respect for rights is interesting. But then at the same time, he then juxtaposes this against this idea of where the UN is called to engage in their activities is normally the only kind of law that exists. And thus they're showing up in these contexts where there's a rupture with regards to kind of like social political order, and they're there to kind of oversee it. And so part of the difficulty with that is I imagine that the populations are traumatic or they're traumatized. I imagine that the security force apparatus is slightly underdeveloped as they're trying to reconstitute itself from the rupture, and that whatever entrenched interest existed before it's not within the mandate of the UN violence workers to address that particular problem, and thus things could be reconstituted, but it could be a reconstitution of the inequality that persisted before, or a new version of it, right? And so that I find to be interesting, but a better understanding of kind of like what's going on.
Luís, go ahead.
No, maybe I should have gone one step behind it to explain that, of course, we are working under the mandate of the Security Council. And the mandate of the Security Council gives the political legitimacy for the police, of course, and in the multidimensional missions, not only the police, our military brothers and the civilian component, because in the multidimensional, clearly, and I believe that's the primacy of politics, it is key to solve the conflicts, to prevent, and as you said in the beginning, Christian, for sustainable peace. The police, of course, and in a non-UN mission concept, also plays a key role, and the police officers usually should be there 24 hours per day. The police officers should always, in terms of democratic policing, being accountable, being responsive to, of course, to the public and to the needs of the public. And that's why the community policing, usually it's something that is really in the heart. But I would go back again, to, of course, to this rule of law perspective, to the legal framework, and of course to the legislation that applies. Usually the police officers do not make the legislation. In a peace operation, there is sometimes, and there is, it's not one size fits all, because all our peace operations are different. Mali is different from South Sudan from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo from Darfur from Guinea-Bissau. So the missions are different. But one thing, it's true. The end state of a peace operation is always more or less the moment that the host state police is credible to provide by itself security to the population. So I believe that this people-centered approach is the key in terms of the police work.
Christian, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So my initial kind of response is the Security Council legitimate? So it's like what becomes interesting is it's kind of like I've never seen a survey, like a global survey. It's kind of like how do you rate, like they do in the United States? It's like which political institutions do you trust and view as trustworthy and efficacious? I've never seen anyone kind of evaluate the Security Council, right? But you do hear different things, and the deference to law thing I think is interesting, because I then ask whose law? And we know that poor people rarely are actually drafting the laws that they are governed by, and thus it becomes an interesting dynamic to argue that deference to law is establishes mandate when that's actually one of the things under contestation, which I think is interesting.
Well, on that, I'm not here to defend the United Nations, but no, but I'm a big fan personally and institutionally of the multilateralism. Because to have all the 193 countries in the General Assembly, the Security Council has a different dimension, but to be able to prevent conflicts, to be able to discuss all the issues, now particularly during the pandemic, the COVID-19, to make sure that the most vulnerable, that the populations that are more the internal displaced people, the refugees, the migrants, women, children, the victims of crimes, that they are protected. I believe that the United Nations, of course, I'm speaking more about the peacekeeping, the special political missions, but as a whole, because all the 2030 agenda, the sustainable development goals, and now with the COVAX for the vaccine, it is to make sure that everyone can, in a certain way, have the baseline and the conditions for a more prosperous future. I will not engage in the political discussions that you are the expert. I will lose with you, Christian, for sure. You are a political scientist. As a matter of fact, let me tell you, in one of the missions where I was commissioner, one sentence I used always to say, police should be apolitical, rigorously apolitical. And in some of the contexts as we serve, as you can understand, that makes a big difference, because of course police officers, once again, always to protect and to serve the population.
On this question, I'm just going to do a little bit of a lightning round question based off of two things that both of you said, and I'm going to ask Christian one question to you, and Luís just one question to you with kind of just short answers, if you could. So Luís, I would be very curious to hear what you have to say about Christian's kind of naming of police officers as violence workers. I'd like you to kind of maybe respond to kind of that categorization of police officers as violence workers. And then Christian, I'd like you to kind of do the opposite. Do you think there are ever conditions under which police officers might actually be promoting human rights or be human rights officers? So Luís, if you want to go first, and then Christian, I'll come back to you, and then we'll go on to the next question.
No, very good. Police, once again, as I said, police office, and the more diverse, representative, accountable, and responsible to the society the police service is, better. The police can, as the so-called jus imperi, that in a certain way can use the force, but always respecting the necessity only when it is necessary, when and if necessary should be proportional to the threat that is going to address, should be lawful, and should be to the minimum use. So the use of force should always respect human rights, and in a certain way, the monopoly of the use of force belongs, but in a lawful way, to these actors, and the police officers, of course, are using the force, not because for their own personal, but institutionally, and to prevent and to protect a major good, that is to protect and to serve the community. So that I would like to make it, of course, very clear. Now, and I can come back to that in terms of the misuse of force, but this is in terms of the principles, what we do, and particularly in the United Nations missions where we serve.
Thank you. Christian.
Good question. So I believe that there are certain circumstances under which the police could promote human rights, but I believe that is an incredibly limited condition. Partly, if you have not been able to kind of intuit thus far from my particular orientation, I'm largely against a monopoly of centralized violence. And thus I think part of the difficulty is the checks on that centralization are so weak in many respects that I'd rather err on the other side and then kind of like discuss acephalous civilizations and how much we don't need centralized coercive force. And so I think there are parameters within which these rights can be protected and individuals could stand up and protect the vulnerable. But I think we're in an interesting moment where we're actually empirically trying to validate that assumption and gauge whether or not that is the case. And this is kind of like Hobbes, right? If the state's use of coercive behavior is reducing the violent behavior of non-state actors, then okay, then they're a little bit more legitimate. If the state is overdoing it with regards to their use of coercive behavior, then we have the right of rebellion then as citizens. And so I think that those parameters, that balance, that Hobbesian balance needs to be operationalized and evaluated constantly. But I think that unfortunately we're on the wrong end of that one.
Thank you. So that's actually an excellent segue into my second question, and which is related to this balance of power. Specifically going into police militarization. So, Luís, as you know, as a police officer in Portugal, one of the reasons that the police have this use of force capacity is because they need to be better armed or better equipped than any of the potential threats that they may face in terms of non-state actors. Right? They need to have a leg up in terms of compared to criminal groups or other non-state actors. And so this is often used as a justification for the militarization of the police. But there's a lot of variation all over the world in terms of that level of militarization in police forces. So some police forces around the world don't even carry guns. And so my question to you, both as a police officer, but also in your role in UNPOL, in terms of overseeing so many different types of police departments around the world, is how appropriate do you think it is for the police to militarize? And then how much capacity of force should police departments have to be effective? What's the limit or threshold? So I will ask you to go first. Thank you.
No, it's a very good question, very challenging one, and I will try in a short way to answer. Clearly, the police systems are different all over the world. The United States different from Portugal, Portugal different from France, France from Central African Republic, and the balance of powers also in terms of the police is different, and the societies are also different. So it's very difficult. So I would say first a tailored approach to each country, to each reality. This is key. And once again, the police should be able first to prevent any use of force. That's why community policing, a police that is part of the community, a community that feels reflected in the police, this is key. And then to have all the wide range in terms of the use of force to prevent any wrongdoing from anyone. And in this use of force, training is key. Sometimes the challenges comes, that's why when we are talking about, and now let me speak about the United Nations, we have formed police units that are tasked and prepared and trained for public order, riot control, but can also, when they are not doing this, do the community policing and to prevent patrolling with the communities. We have also individual police officers with particular skills and specialized skills, either in to address sexual gender-based violence, to address the needs of the community, to prevent. But a police service should have all the spectrum in terms of the use of force, but let's be clear, to prevent conflicts, because when the conflict comes, there is always one part that is not happy. And that's when, of course, the skills and the training is key, of course, to use it.
Thank you. Christian, your reflections about police militarization.
You won't be surprised that I believe we should move to nonviolence. I think the setup of the question is highly militarized in many respects, again, highlighting the worst in human beings, right? So the justification for militarization is that there's other people have bad people out there have weapons, and so we need more weapons so we could take them out. If we hadn't seen a lot of kind of state violence workers overdo it, then maybe I'd go along with that argument. But I think in many respects, we need to be very careful about that. If the violence workers believe that they need better or more weapons, then we should have an open evaluation of force escalation continua. So please, I'd be curious from Luís if this exists. Many police departments have a discussion of kind of like the activities that the police can engage in relative to what the civilians can engage in, and they look at the kind of proportional relationships. And I think everybody on the planet should have some sense of what the relevant force escalation continua is in their community, and we should allow people to vote on what they think should be done in terms of responsiveness, and get away from the problem with the militarization question is the militarization is a response to some threat, but who's collecting the data on the threat? It's the very same agency that we expect to check themselves subsequently. So we need independent agencies to assess threats, to then figure out exactly how to hold people accountable in terms of their proportional response. And so I think in that respect, a democratization effectively of oversight regarding violence workers is something that needs to happen.
Luís?
It's always very difficult because of course, I will not speak about the political dimension of the answer. And as you spoke about Portugal, let me tell you, in the Global Peace Index, Portugal ranks 3rd in terms of the most safe country in the world. So I'm very pleased to be Portuguese in this index. And in terms of addressing your question, clearly there is a dimension that how can I say, the de-escalation, the dialogue, the presence, because unfortunately, let me give an example in the negative way. In some of the peace operations where we serve, or in some of the missions where we are, the private groups, armed groups, criminal groups, terrorists occupied this space, and then the populations were hostage of these groups. And unfortunately, when also, because of course the problem is political, but when you don't have a police service that is able to occupy this space, and when the people take the power in their hands to protect themselves or not to protect themselves, when these groups take this power, it's clearly a nightmare where the public, the private, who has the ownership in the use of force, and usually, unfortunately, there are people that die, and then to regain, once again, this balance between freedom and security in an organized way, it is a big challenge. Clearly, I'm a big supporter, of course, of the democratic principles of policing, and once again, the police should always protect and respect human rights. This is, of course, one of the principles of the United Nations Police. That's clear.
Christian, you have a response.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm sure, Luís, that you're not suggesting that your mandate is not political. So I know you wish to punt on the political, but the law is politically derived, no, and thus your responding to the mandate is political. That was the first part. The second part was kind of like the reason why we see kind of like rebellious behavior, terrorism, and protest is quite frequently because of state violence and inequality, and thus you being called in to respond to the rebel terrorist part is kind of interesting, given the difficulty, given the reason why they emerged in the first place is connected to some form of state malfeasance or violent behavior.
Well, in our no, let me make it. It was a very good point, the point that you made about political, because I believe that police being a political is the best political tool that we can have to make one society live in a balanced way. So, so I don't want to skip that political, but what I don't want to say, or what I want to say, is that police officers should protect all alike. It doesn't matter what political affiliation, it doesn't matter what ethnical, geographic origin, it doesn't matter the sex, it doesn't matter whatever the people are. And so on that dimension, clearly the police should be a political. And the police should also feel, myself being a police officer, when sometimes people, oh, the police officers are more target in terms of either the society. It is true, because we have the responsibility in terms of the use of force, so we should be more scrutinized internally, externally, formally and informally. And we can come back to that, because it's a very interesting dimension, the formal and formal control, external and internal control of the police. And we police officers, I'm the first one to say that we need to accept that.
Okay, if there are no other responses, I think we'll just go to the next question, if that's okay. So this question is about really the shift in the movement here in the US in terms of, there's always been an abolition movement for policing, but it came to the forefront this summer in the US, where the, quote unquote, mainstream media picked up the defund the police / abolish the police force kind of rhetoric. And so this question actually goes to you, Luís, first, is do you think that it's ever the right solution to abolish the police? And especially because, this is often what the UN is involved in, is that it's involved with actually taking apart police forces that have been very violent and then putting them back together in terms of new recruitment and new training. And so, should the police ever be abolished? Under what conditions? And what benefits do you think come from rebuilding police forces anew? And how should those police forces be rebuilt?
No, thank you very much for that question. You will understand that I will not comment in terms of the country that is, of course, hosting ourselves. And let me tell you that I feel perfectly safe every day in New York, where I am based now. Concerning clearly the work that we do with the host state, national ownership in terms of the building or rebuilding or reforming of development of the police services is key. And the solution is never always only with the police. It's to have a recruitment and a selection that is representative from all the country, representative from all the religions of the country, representative from all the geographic origins of the country, representative of all the social origins of the country, but also we are talking about the security system, but we need to speak about the justice system. We need to speak about the state, the restoration of state authority, because in some areas the state needs to be present. So all the areas, like a puzzle, we can all contribute to further social and economic development. Clearly, the security is one of the first steps, but it is this building is always based on national ownership, and we are always there to support, empower, and to help the capacity of the host state. So I want to make that point very clear, and clearly, as I said, the police is always a key institution in terms of the end state of a peace operation. So the police is always a key institution in the beginning of a new life in any country.
Thank you. Christian, your reflections about abolishing the police and then rebuilding them.
One, the more I hear Luís speak, I want the UN to be in Ferguson. I want them to be in every city in America, basically, given what he's talking about. I think it's the correct call. The abolition and defund, although it should just be called the reprioritization movement, effectively, because no one really talks about 60s and 70s when money was taken away from a bunch of these social services and then given to the police, leaving us with one response to a host of other types of problems. We need to link this back to deindustrialization. We need to link this back to how those priorities got removed in the first place, because that's what we're talking about now. We're talking about reprioritizing, right? And so I think that's the right call. But back to Hobbes, I'm just like, if state violence workers are exceeding the use of violence used by behavioral challengers, then they are illegitimate and they deserve to be removed. They deserve to be restructured. They deserve to be made accountable. And I think that's the space that we give in that's really important. Although what's interesting about this is there's the book On Killing by, I'm forgetting his name now. It'll come to me. And then also Randall Collins's work on violence. There's a certain type of individual that wishes to engage in violence work. And so you have a rupture in society and then you're trying to reconstitute, even if you abolish and then defund, then you're going to try to reconstitute the institution. There's a certain type of individual that's going to want to come to this institution, and they might want to engage in actual violence. And so it's an interesting dynamic that we need to kind of be very conscientious about exactly who wants this type of work and who's going to do it. But I think, as Luís was hinting at, civilians need to be intricately involved in the recreation and repopulation of the violence worker institution, to turn it to nonviolence to begin with, but also to think about exactly who's constituting it. But then some of the complexities of what he identified. So in the Northern Ireland case, Republicans didn't want to be violence workers, and thus those associated with a loyalist position were more than willing to assume that position. So you might have the desire to try to get people in there, then that's going to be somewhat, I think, problematic. And then the African Americans that want to be violence workers, you could argue that they are predisposed one way or the other. So I think the reconstitution is incredibly complex to think about. I see that I'm getting like flashed for time. Are we like timed on this too?
No, you're good. You're okay.
Okay, I'm just checking. It's like I just see it popping up in my face, and so I think that issue is really useful. But and it'll be useful actually to kind of get some documentation from the UN about restructuring, abolition, and reconstitution, because effectively that's one of the things that's on the agenda to kind of think through. But we don't have many models to talk about. Okay, how do we start from scratch? What would that look like? And there's only been a couple of places that have actually kind of like restructured in any substantive way. And so I think we're at a loss for models. And so it'd be useful to draw upon the rest of the world. Of course, being Americans, they don't think that there's any relevance whatsoever for the United States from the rest of the world for a variety of different elitist reasons. But I think we should be open to that.
Luís, maybe you could comment a little bit about how the UN does conceptualize when it goes into a country and has to start from scratch in terms of building the police force.
No, it's a very interesting discussion. Let me, from the conceptual and framework point of view, we have something, not we, the member states, because the United Nations doesn't exist per se. The United Nations is what the member states want the United Nations to be. So we have the strategic guidance framework for international policing. That are some guidelines that were developed with the support of the member states, and now it's a baseline that we use in our peace operations. But once again, I would like to stress national ownership. The countries are different. Some countries, they have national police, gendarmerie, judicial police, Garde Nationale. Some countries, they have only one police service. So the countries are different. But the principles are the same. And when I was saying that the United Nations police, the big richness is the 90 different nationalities, it's because we also learn with each other. We go to a peace operation, we learn from each other, we leave the skills, we help to rebuild, we help the capacity building. When we go back to our own countries, we also bring that level of expertise. So these skills transfer, it's key. From the conceptual point of view, of course, the strategic guidance can work. Of course, in the country, there is also the legislation. If there are legislation, as it happened already, that goes against the human rights in some countries or in some missions where we are, that part does not apply in the work that we do. But clearly, how can I say, the police should always have that people-centered approach, but we should not also have a police state. What do I mean? Clearly, the civilian oversight of the police, as it is, as the internal oversight of the police, it's key, because individuals are different from the institutions. And in the institutions, one of the main, I would leave with this, one of the main topics, it's discipline. And I stop here.
Christian, do you have a response to that?
I do, although I'll be pushing Luís, I guess on the same political point in many respects, because it's just like civilian oversight in the context of like civil war, genocide, and some like mass killings is like really hard to do, right? And then the civilians that would step forward, it's hard to imagine that you'd have a general sense of how representative that particular population would be, especially if anyone from the pre-existing regime is around to help you find these populations. And so it's an interesting dynamic to think about who is available. And I think about it in the context of the United States, right? It's just like, okay, so if hopefully the UN would come into American cities and help them to reconstitute themselves, they then need to constitute the town hall of a representative group of individuals to actually speak to the problems and desires that they have, and then use that information. It's like the civilian participation rate within the United States, especially for town hall conversations, would be incredibly low. And so it just seems to be, as I think through this mental model of Luis walking out into the streets of New York and then going across to go to New Jersey, where they need him more than Manhattan, actually, because there's no crime in Manhattan, right? But then that would be an interesting kind of dynamic to play out, to think about exactly who would be willing to speak, who would be comfortable to speak, who would be too scared to speak, and how you'd overcome those limitations when you see this force coming in with weapons that is kind of associated in your mind to those that were previously there engaging in similar behavior. It's a very difficult task that that the institution is engaging in.
And this is actually an excellent segue to what might be the potentially the last question, at least that I have prepared, if we'll kind of see how time goes, because there is actually one more question that I'd like to ask. But this question segues nicely into this idea about accountability, and whether the police can ever be held accountable and who should hold them accountable. And so this question is for you, Christian. I mean, it is really that question. Can the police ever be held accountable? And, you know, given that the public is very diverse, like you've just mentioned, and we don't know who would volunteer to be on a civilian oversight board, et cetera, that there's all kinds of power dynamics associated with who gets to speak and who doesn't. Do you have any ideas about how that could be structured, or how the police could ever be held accountable, and if even civilian oversight is the right institutions or institutional model to do that?
One, I really liked your question regarding use of violence against civilians that we appear to be bypassing. So I'd hope you'd ask that one still. But I think that the police could potentially be accountable, and they should be accountable to citizens, except I feel as if citizen oversight and even community involvement in policing is kind of like punting, because it makes it seem as if citizens are more than capable and willing and understanding of what's going on, and they're able to engage in a way. And that we don't view community policing as citizen co-optation with the state project. So I'm like, in many respects, I think there's a bunch of stuff that's kind of like loaded in this in many respects, which I think is an issue to think about. But, you know, how do you make violence workers beholden to civilians that don't have economic and political power? I mean, we're then asking individuals to kind of like, let's skate past the history that led to the inequities in the first place, and now let's treat everybody equally. And I'm like, oh, like that's not going to happen. And so I think that's somewhat difficult. I think there's differences that exist within the population, but you know, I'll go back to Maslow, right? There's those kind of like base needs that everyone has. Fundamentally, that's what's going to account for the similarities for the populations, and the degree to which people can highlight that, I think, is useful. I'm a huge fan of R2P, right? And hence my willingness to kind of have Luis walking down the street in New York. I think this is specifically related to this Hobbesian balance. When state violence workers exceed the parameters of acceptable violence, which should be somehow determined, then someone needs to step in. And those people that step in, it's interesting, they'll have a higher sense of what rights should be respected than the people that are engaging in the violence within the territory. But then to say that they're then responsible to the civilian population that's traumatized, not communicating and isolating and fleeing and so forth, it's very difficult, because then they have to kind of assume these positions in the abstract, because the very population that they're there to serve is largely too damaged to actually participate in the governance project itself. And so that protectorate model, I think, is very useful in many respects, but then it then doesn't deal with the entrenched inequities that were created in the first place. And so Luis's attempt to not stay political, but still establish some order and stability, I think is, that then becomes really problematic, because then these entrenched inequities that led to all the problems in the first place, we don't get to getting rid of them. And that will then, I think, return us back to these problems.
Luís, if you could just give your thoughts about the accountability mechanisms and civilian oversight, and then I will ask the violence question after that, and then we'll move on to the Q&A from the audience.
The police, first of all, is accountable to the public. They serve. So this centrality of the people the people, because once again, police officers are coming from the community and they go back to the community. And this is key to understand the community policing, because let's also make it clear, it's impossible to have one police officer for each person. And so the society need to find their own balance everywhere. And the people are part, of course, of the community. But first, the hierarchy should make sure that it works in terms, once again, of the rules and the regulations, the respect for human rights. Then you have the justice system when the cases of misconduct go above the limit. Then you have also the civilian oversight that can be done politically. And I'm talking about the formal mechanisms, but you have the informal mechanisms. We have first the press. The press plays a key role. The civil society, the NGOs play also a key role in terms of the control of the police. Civic associations to make sure that, once again, this balance in the society exists. And also, because the people say something to the community, say something to the press, say something different to the police, and it is important in some of the peace operations where we are, all the communities, first the word police is very touchable, while some other words like rule of law are more difficult to understand, but police is very touchable. And the populations, particularly the ones that were deprived from security, the first thing that they want is police, is community police, is to feel the presence of the police. So this accountability comes with the responsibility, and once again, I would start with that accountability to the public, but speaking also about the other formal mechanisms of control of the police.
Thank you. Okay, I am going to take the moderator privilege and ask one more of my questions, and then we'll move on to the Q&A from the audience. And we have a lot of questions from the audience, so that's great. So this last question is about police violence and the conditions under which police violence happens and why it happens. The academic literature suggests that there are three possible reasons. So the first is that the police are kind of the hand of the state. And so leaders call on the police to suppress dissent, and so the police obey. That's the first possibility. The second possibility is that the police themselves are political actors and have reasons of their own to use violence for their own political gain. So that's reason number two. And reason number three is related to institutional racism or biases within the police force or police force culture that may lead to the disproportionate use of force against some community members by some police officers or the majority of them, depending on the police culture and the police department. So those are the three kind of reasons in the academic literature. So I would like the two of you to maybe comment on the conditions under which you think that the police do become violent, and if there's any resonance with the three reasons that I've brought up. And then, Luís, for the UN, it would be great to know when you think UNPOL and formed police units engage in excessive violence in the countries where they work, or engage in sexual exploitation and abuse, are those explanations that I provided also applicable to UN policing? And I will, actually, Christian, if you can go first.
So I like this question in part because I think it's very foundational, right? Statehood is violence. This is Vandenberg, this is Jim Scott. The centralization and capture of populations is in and of itself violent. So this is why Nicole Siegel's label of violence worker steps out. But if you take, I like Jim Scott's Against the Grain book, but if you think about this, he's got, we've got 200,000 years of Homo sapiens, 5,000 years of small, weak states, and 1,000 years of effectively housing humans and small property owners and representation in the 17th century. But there's a long history of life outside the state and that life inside the state until the 18th century. And so my thing is, most of our existence on the planet has not involved centralized political authorities, centralized coercive enforce, or the police. And thus, in many respects, I think this focus is slightly off because we end up reprioritizing. It's interesting, if you think of the cases that Luís is talking about, we're talking about a complete rupture of a state's ability to act. And in that rupture, they're stepping in to help. But what's reconstituted could be problematic in many ways, because now it might be more reliant upon certain types of violence workers and violent work than it would otherwise. About the three kind of explanations you came up with, which I find interesting, is like, I think they're all intricately connected, so it's hard to pull them apart. The inequity discussion with regards to the violent use of behavior is interesting, right? So everyone keeps going on like African Americans are killed disproportionate to their size in the population. I'm like, well, they're not killed in disproportionate to their degree of exploitation, vulnerability, and necessity for having to engage in survival crimes and so forth. So if we talk more class and vulnerability and weakness, then they would be directly proportional to kind of like what we would find in the population as opposed to what we get there. But it's really problematic to hear, well, if Black people were killed at just 13%, that would be okay. I don't want anyone killed. I don't want anyone engaging in any violence whatsoever. I don't want proportional to the population. I want zero. So I want us to change our baseline to get away from this, because especially the political scientists, we're horrible about this. It's like, oh, disproportionate to the size of the population, disproportionate to the size of the population. I'm just like, how about away from zero? I mean, we need to change our standard. And so I think our sensitivity to the violence label would be quite useful. I think anyone with a weapon is violent. I think anyone who can call someone with a weapon is violence. And so my conception is perhaps a little bit larger than many, but I'm like, okay, I've seen enough people with weapons to realize, you know what, this can go bad really quickly. And so I don't want anyone to have a weapon. And once you spend time in Scandinavia as well, you're just like, you know what, I feel much safer now.
Thank you. And Luís.
No, I agree with Christian that the three dimensions of the use of the, how can I say, the misuse of force, either to obey personal or institutional, how can I say, they are interlinked, because usually you don't see one alone. But I would go one step above that. First, either in the United Nations or outside, but clearly United Nations, because you asked about cases of excess use of force, or cases about misuse of force, or cases of indiscipline, or cases of sexual exploitation and abuse, as you said. Let me start very bluntly to say, our Secretary General and all of us, zero tolerance on sexual exploitation and abuse. It is not admissible that populations that were expecting us to go and protect, that there is 1, 2, 3, 4, whoever are, that are not accountable for that trust. So that's, please talk about it. And then, of course, we need to have the mechanisms to address, and we need to have the mechanisms to make sure that people that conduct cases of misconduct or even allegedly crimes are made responsible, and this is publicized. So there is no one, because it's not because of 1, 2, or 3 that the other 1,000 or millions need to feel responsible. And so I would go exactly the other way around in terms of deconstructing the 3 reasons. Institutionally, the principles need to be, and that's where it comes to civilian oversight. If there is institutionally or even politically, and then once again, the political power is the principle of the representativity. The political leadership, once again, is the people, the politicians, the people elect. So the politicians are the representatives, and then the police are also in that chain. And then, of course, there is a dimension there that we are not addressing, but clearly genocide is unacceptable. Clearly there are certain type of principles that go above, that is the human dimension, and on that the responsibility to protect that we all have. And that's why we have the protection of civilians that go above that dimension when unfortunately the legal framework at the national level is eroded to a level that the principle disappear. So also in the building of the police institutions, and I will end up now, in building the police institutions, these dimensions of discipline, accountability are key. We are not yet addressing that dimension, but clearly building oversight mechanisms, either the ombudsman at the national level or the inspection at the police level, are key for the credibility of the institutions themselves.
Excellent. Any response, Christian, or should we move on to the audience?
No, I'm good. I'm liking Luís more all the time.
Excellent. Okay. So I'm going to now move on to questions from the audience. And the first one actually relates, so this is a question that came during registration, but also relates to a question from the Q&A that was just submitted. And this has to do with the difference between the police and the military. So Alec Giofurta, who's a Cornell undergrad, asks, how can we distinguish police violence from violence by the military? And specifically for Christian, is there more of a clear definition of violence worker that applies to all people that use violence? So does that definition include the military as well? If not, why? But really this question is really about kind of distinguishing police violence and military violence and whether there's a line, or should we think of them as the same?
That's for me.
Christian first, yeah, and then Luís.
So I would refer the question asker to the Violence Worker book by Nicole Siegel. And so if you take the kind of Weberian conception of what a state is defined as, the whole point of her book is that essentially anyone that is in the state's employ is a violence worker because they are associated with the coercive and forceful activities. They either are armed themselves or they have a direct access to people that will work on their behalf to do things. And so it immediately expands your conception of exactly what's going on, but it goes to the Weberian conception of the state and this monopoly of coercion and force. And so the distinction, and so one of the things that she challenges is this myth of there's a common distinction between the police, the so-called police, and the military, that the military are external and the police are domestic. Her book is about the fluidity of the two, that you have individuals that are serving in a police force, they join the military, they come back, they are in the military, they join some private organization, they come back and they consult with the police. There's a fluidity between these institutions. And so we speak of the militarization of the police, for example, as if it goes one way, but we don't speak about the policefication of the military when the military are asked to do things that basically would fall under the police mandate. And so what's keeping these two separate categories together is as much myth as it is actuality, when you have the same kind of individuals that are fluidly jumping back and forth between them, and also the private sector. We can't forget that. And they're adjudicating and it's consulting and trading, and there's weapons that are going different directions. So I think we're as much as the problem with keeping these distinctions alive than they actually exist when you start looking at the particularities of who's doing what where.
Thank you. Luís, do you have a comment about the difference between the police and the military?
No, of course, the simplistic approach is exactly that one. Police, domestic security issues, military, interstate. But of course, it's not one size fits all, and the countries are different. And there are countries, and of course, we need to read the constitution, the internal laws. But I would address also in a different angle. The police is usually to protect the populations, while the military, and usually there is only one military institution, is to protect the state, even if it is also simplistic. There is also another paradox that I want to introduce, that is usually when the democracies are very open, the rights are freely exercised, and the police should have more rights because the people are more freely to exercise their rights, is exactly the other way around. So this paradox in terms of the balance police authority and the rights of the people to exercise are also an interesting discussion, because then it also goes to the police and the military discussion. In our peace operations, what, of course, is the threat that guides the institution to address? Military threat should be addressed by military component, and the police threat in a certain way, or the police conflicts or situations of police nature should be addressed by police officers. Public order, community policing, criminal investigation, sexual gender-based violence. So all of these are of police nature. Just one last note, that it is to say, clearly, training and coordination is key. Coordination between police and military, and of course, the primacy of politics. The primacy of politics is key, because the police and also the military, clearly, they have to be under the civilian oversight umbrella.
Thank you. Christian, you wanted to make a quick comment? Go ahead.
It was just a quick one. It's like, I remember reading about kind of like British use of kind of counterinsurgency tactics in Northern Ireland, then subsequently informing British development of kind of like bobbies and so forth. And similarly, the US counterinsurgent activities in Central America and Africa, those individuals that came back then gave those tactics that they had learned abroad to the local context. So again, showing this fluidity, I thought was kind of interesting.
Yes, and actually that's a really nice segue into the question that I was going to ask from Michael Centers, who is a Peace and Conflict Fellow and Master's student here at Cornell. And so he asks, first, actually, I'm going to ask this for Luís. What, if anything, can the US police departments learn from UN police? And then separately, what legacy does the US attempts to export kind of their style of law enforcement globally, especially in the 1960s with more of a counterinsurgency model, have? So what is the legacy of US police assistance, but then also what can the UN, or the US learn from the UN engaging in kind of the police assistance that the UN provides?
No, thank you. Thank you very much for that question. The United States is a member state of the United Nations and a big supporter of the United Nations police, being member of the Security Council, where the mandates derive from. Clearly, the United States support through that, and of course, indirect, because it's the mandates of the Security Council. At a more operational level, the United States was very supportive in terms of the strategic guidance framework. The United States is also very supportive in terms of supporting and directive, because once again, the United Nations are the member states, in terms of the performance and the accountability. So all of that, and in a certain way, I could not be, how can I say, to be seen as arrogant in terms of what can we, but of course the United States is a big supporter of the work that United Nations Police does and the peacekeeping as a whole, even in terms of the policies, action for peacekeeping, the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, and of course what once again we want is to make a positive impact in the communities where we serve, and the United States as one of the founders, but also one of the key member states of the United Nations, plays a key role.
Okay. Christian, do you want to comment?
Oh, yes. I still want Luís to answer the part about what the US police could learn from the UN. So I'd like him to go back to that one. But this export legacy thing is fascinating. What law enforcement legacy has the US exported? I think of Darius Rejali's book on how the US exported torture techniques, Or you take David Vine's new book, The United States of War or Base Nation, to talk about exactly how covert operations, extensive militarization, extensive targeted assassinations, and other forms of counterinsurgency activities were exported. That's the thing we've exported. If you start looking at what different nations have said about our activities around the globe, not what we say about it, but what they say about what our involvement in the globe has been, assassinating Lumumba. I mean, like, the list of covert ops in and of itself is like fascinating. So that's intricately connected with our legacy. This is part of the reason why the world responds to us in the way that they do. So when we show up to talk about policing or law enforcement, this is why we get some resistance, and why historically it's been kind of like a really kind of like major issue. In part, if we separate military, paramilitary, intelligence from policing, then we might be able to kind of talk about a kind of law enforcement legacy. But if we are putting things together like many people around the world would do, then CIA activities would be overlaying with law enforcement, and that has not always been a good story for human rights and violence.
Luís, did you want to respond?
No, I won't, because of course Christian is not making my life easy, but that's what is interesting, because the police officers in the street, they don't have the life easy. So it's always the conflict, and how to avoid, how to prevent, but also to address in case the conflict, and the police officers usually do not escape, they are always there. We always learn from each other. Today, I learned a lot, even in terms of being a police officer, in terms of police, from Christian and from the questions. And clearly, we learn from each other, the United Nations police, and let me tell you, because the United States was also a police contributing country. So on that, and we cannot put everyone in the same bag. Of course, when I was in my first UN mission back in Bosnia in '96 in Croatia, I was human rights trainer. And the first thing was, intelligence is clearly different from police, because the trust that the police needs to have of the communities, it is key. And so building from this trust, it's where everything starts. And once again, rule of law means that no one is above the law. Not even police officers. The police officers are the first ones that, leading by example, should give that example. And that I will go back, of course, to the point, either from the personal point of view, to obey to the hierarchy, or if the institutional, then yes, the police officer should not, and is authorized in any country in the world, if the order is illegal, not to follow the order. So easy to say, difficult to do. I know, because of course the environment is very impactful on the life of the police officer, but clearly the institutions should, and the individuals should always, and particularly in the United Nations also, always have their attitude, their actions by the highest criteria of respect for everyone, particularly the human being.
Great. I'm going to try to squeeze in one, or maybe hopefully two questions with the last few minutes that we have left. But this next question is from Tracy Matrano, who actually was a Democratic candidate for Congress in this district and for 2 years running now. And she asks about this idea of the trade-off again, and the trade-off between security and then other kinds of important public goods that the government provides. So, we have a finite kind of budget, and so does it make sense to focus so much resources on law enforcement as opposed to the things that are perhaps maybe more needed, such as social services, mental health care, etc. And so how do the police kind of justify the budgets that they have, given these other kinds of concerns that the government, local governments should address? And Christian, do you want to go first with that?
Great question. So I'm not sure how Luís will go, if he's going to continue with the apolitical thing, then they're not going to have much to say about this redistribution issue. But I think if we think more critical to the kind of root problem, one of the reasons why we have police, we say, is to guarantee, establish security from people that might engage in violence potentially. But the people that engage in violence potentially are responding to poverty and inequitable distributions of resources and state violence. So if we eliminate those three problems, which could be handled in part by social service delivery or redistribution, then we've eliminated the necessity for police, and then they're gone. So part of my kind of like riff in many respects is the police are a stopgap to try to deal with the inefficiencies of the market and resulting inequalities that emerge from it. If we have these inequalities and we are going to accept these inequalities, then we're going to accept that the police have to be around and occasionally engage in violence. If we don't accept inequality, we eliminate that, then we eliminate the need for crime and eliminate for certain forms of policing. Generally speaking, there'll always be some individuals that engage in violence that'll need to be treated in a particular manner. But I think that is not the majority of the situations that we're dealing with. But in Luís's context, this is when, for lack of a better phrase, hell has been released on earth, and some attempt needs to be established to establish order. And that is unfortunately coercive and forceful, and it's lacking normative and material capabilities in that particular context. And so worst case scenario in many respects, I think much of the conversation we have about policing in some locations isn't worst case scenario. And we're just trying to figure out how to get the police out of our lives, because basically they're not there most of the time. They don't engage with us most of the time, and they only show up at a small point in time. And so this trade-off you're talking about, I think of access to resources and that distribution as being everyday, and police presence as being much less ubiquitous and thus less of a priority. Sorry, it's too long.
Okay, and Luís?
No, in the post-conflict environments, where usually the United Nations police acts and the United Nations peace operations, clearly there is a huge need. The populations, they want public security, public safety, and they want police, because the space was occupied by the non-state actors, that ones, yes, illegal or illegitimate owners of the violence that is infliged over the populations. So these clearly, and but there is one point that I agree: the social dimension, clearly the development dimension, the humanitarian dimension, even the education, access to education, because it's the big social elevator, the lift for the communities that can bring. And that's where the United Nations, I believe, in terms of multilateralism, through the different agencies, funds and programs, can bring hope, and the police can bring trust. And it is from this contribution of everyone that politically, the primacy of politics, and now I didn't escape, Christian, the primacy of politics, leadership is key. And leadership, when we are talking about leadership, we are talking about politics. So I end up here.
Great, thank you. I do, we had over 25 questions left. We're not going to get to them all, unfortunately, but I do want to thank everybody for sending such excellent questions. I will wrap up tonight by giving each speaker a minute to kind of have some closing remarks and reflections on the discussion tonight. I'll start with Luís, and then I'll have Christian finish us off. So Luís, thank you very much again for being here tonight. We'd love to hear your kind of reflections of the conversation.
Very good. First, thank you very much for the invitation to Cornell University and the Oversight Center. And it was a pleasure to discuss with Christian, very, very interesting, and to discuss with the audience. The message that I would like to leave, it is, police is a very challenging and a very altruistic and very difficult mission, where clearly the accountability should always be present. The last message is we all should, and particularly being part of the United Nations Police, we have the responsibility all to say and to do how we can contribute to build a better work. And that's where I believe the United Nations Police, the United Nations, but also the academia, like the Cornell University, can play a key role. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you. And Christian.
So thank you very much. I want to elect Luís to something. So that was it's very good to get a general sense of kind of like what's going on, and to the extent to which he actually made the comment earlier that there's not enough research done on UN policing, and so I definitely like to encourage as many people as possible to contact him about trying to do that. As for kind of like my comments at the end inequality, it's the root of most of our problems. End state violence. Start thinking about thriving. If you don't know what it is, then start grabbing stuff, because the thriving literature, once you look at it, you're just like, what else have I been doing all this time? What have I been thinking about? And start using the phrase violence worker and watch what it changes in your conversations about what states do. Because the minute you break that down, I mean, who was jumping up and down about the Weberian conception of the state as being tied to violence, but we just all kind of accepted it and moved on. But if that's true, then it's all about violence work. And then we need to think about what else we'd like in there. And I think that's where I'll stop. But thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the two of you for such an engaging conversation. And thank you for the 100 plus people that attended tonight. And in particular, another big thank you to Judith Lund-Biggs for making this conversation tonight. And I think it was a very fruitful discussion I definitely learned a lot from the both of you. So thank you again, and we wish you the best of luck. Thank you.